Ladies and gentlemen, can we have your attention, please, for our next session? I introduce you to Amy Jackson. Amy is a Nuffield Scholar 2012 from the UK, and she is also director at Oxtale and an expert in communications, crisis management, and she will today address for us the issue of finding common ground. So we hope to have a really good conversation around that topic. Amy,
thank you, Catherine. Thank you. And thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. I just want to say a massive congratulations to the scholars who are graduating or presenting today, to the ones who are currently doing travels, to the ones who've just started. And it's a fantastic opportunity, and it's just great to see the discussion around such fantastic papers. So great to be part of this. So I have been asked to talk about finding common ground, and really poignant that all four presentations today are about the tricky issues of environment. When I was asked to do this, I started having a good look. I was aware of the issues here, aware of issues in New Zealand as well, which I think are relatively similar. And so I started having a look at what was actually going on and what actual challenges you were facing and what the narrative was around this to try and help inform my talk today. So I'm just going to give you a bit of background about where I'm coming from. There's a bit of a blurb in the program, but fundamentally I started out quite a practical nature, working on farms, did a diploma, ended up kind of doing a bit of auctioneering, a bit of in the cattle breeding sector, and then I sort of fell into agricultural PR and did sort of communications work for product companies and so on. And then I ended up getting into issues in crisis management. I had a bit of involvement in the horse meat issue, and then in 2010 I got involved in this, which was the Nocton dairies issue. And I don't know if you're aware of it, but it was a proposal to build a farm of 8,000 cows in Lincolnshire. And so this was 8,000 cows housed year-round. And it just caused an enormous ruckus in the UK. It was being covered in every mainstream media outlet. People just couldn't get their head around what was going on with a farm of this size, what it would be like, completely unprecedented. And we had 70,000 people signing a petition globally, 14,000 written objections to the local council. About a quarter of our MPs tabled a motion against it. And this was back in 2010, 2011. This was really kind of in the infancy of social media. And we set up an information website. And there were only 10,000 visits to that. Given all the objections, hardly anyone made an effort to actually find out what was going on this farm. So this set me thinking, what is it that we can't do right? What are we not getting across to people that means they just have this knee-jerk reaction and they don't want to find out more? They just reject things like this. So that started me off on my Nuffield journey. I applied to find out whether we can learn to love the mega dairy, and I was given an award and was able to go studying that across various parts of the world, and came back with some good insights that we would probably have to change because we were not really going to have be able to change the public. And the fact that the public were a stakeholder in this was a really important finding to me, is that we might know all the answers to do with cow welfare and the technical side, but actually their feelings and their perceptions about this really mattered. So with those learnings, I started to change how we were communicating, but I still didn't really have the answers. And then I got an opportunity to do a PhD back in 2016, funded by our levy board, AHDB. And having done that now, I feel I really have got more sense of what's going on and maybe what we need to do. And that is combining with my experience in communications to help change our approach to this issue. And so that message, one message from that to you today is that Nuffield scholarship is just the start. It's a lifelong learning. You don't have to stop it there. You can go on and do other things to keep developing that knowledge. So I'm going to share a bit about what I've now learned. So The issues you're facing at the moment, I would say, very much represent a conflict. There's a huge amount going on, whether it's about greenhouse gas emissions or air and water quality, biodiversity, all the subjects around diets, vegan diets and so on coming into this. So it's a conflict, and what I read in the media is about that conflict, about butting heads over this issue. So looking a little bit about conflicts, it's helpful to understand what conflicts are about and how they happen. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of this, about what is a conflict, why does this matter, why should we try and understand what's going on. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we deal with that in farming, and then I'm going to give you a case study at the end of a way in which, in the UK, we approached a big issue, a big conflict, and we managed to turn it around. So, first of all, there's two types of conflict broadly, cooperative conflicts and a competitive conflict. And cooperative conflicts, I'm just looking, I thought there was a screen somewhere, there we go. Cooperative conflicts tend to be characterized by shared or linked goals. So we both win, we both lose, we both sink, we both swim. And that means you've got some common interests at heart. Whereas competitive conflicts often feel as if there's got to be a winner or a loser. So only one person can win out of this. So things like a planning application, for example, will tend to be either you win it or you lose it. So if you have the public against you, that's what you're risking. In terms of cooperative conflicts, they're often more constructive, more friendly. There's more effective communication. There's a sort of shared ownership of the problem. Whereas in competitive conflicts, it's the opposite, is obstructiveness, quite often power games, coercion. And you'll often find there's an imbalance of power as well, which leaves one party feeling kind of really struggling to try and gain control of the situation. And in cooperative conflicts, there's often, we have these motivations that people have when they get involved in conflicts. So often there's a search for accuracy, like what are the facts? What are we actually dealing with here? Because it's a more collaborative approach, so it's important to understand what are the facts, what's the detail, what do we need to know, and also wanting to be seen as constructive impression on others. Whereas with your competitive conflict, it's about defending. It's about defending your position, dying in a ditch over it if you have to, and also thinking about your impression on others in terms of being dominant and aggressive and basically occupying that ground. So these are the two types of conflict. Now, in thinking about where you are here in Ireland in this conflict you have over the environment, I would say you're in a competitive situation. Now, you could walk away from this and say, you know, we don't want to get involved, but I don't think you've got a choice in this. So there's an interdependence here. You've got no choice but to engage, and it's a competitive situation. And the reason you can't walk away, usually, generally, is there's something you need to gain or you need to avoid a loss. And the loss can be, you know, a license to produce, penalties, freedom, sales, reputation, all kinds of things like that. So I would argue that you've really got no choice but to engage on this subject. Now, in terms of what you have to lose, the way I look at it is you have a relatively small population and a huge amount of agricultural production. And globally, over the next 10 years, demand for food is only going to rise. It's estimated to go up by 1% to 2% per annum in pretty much all the main commodities. So you have a good reason for sales. Even if everybody in Ireland went vegan overnight and stopped consuming animal products, you've still got huge global markets out there, and you're very well positioned to service them. But it's not all about sales, because if people don't like your product, they can stop buying it, but you've still got that huge global demand. But what we really need to start thinking about more is what I would call citizens. So the challenges I would say you have here are to do with citizens, about the people you share the country with, who breathe the same air, who drink the same water, who share the land, and feel that the reputation of Ireland is important to them. So I would say this topic of social license has come up a few times already. And social license is really, really important because it can really affect your ability to produce. It can create barriers, it can lead to activism and incursions and exposés, and I know you have exposés as well. I think there was one on dairy calves quite recently. We're getting them all the time in the UK. You can also get increased retailer and supply chain demands. We're getting ever-increasing requirements. You can get more legislation. You can get planning constraints, difficulties getting your planning permissions through. So all this leads to quite a lot of mental exhaustion, physical exhaustion, and really quite a difficult working environment. Now, I was quite interested to see, back to the sales point, I was looking at your Food Values 2030 report, which I thought was really interesting. And again, I see a really, really clear commitment to production there. In the introduction, it says, farming is Ireland's oldest and largest indigenous industry. In 2020, it was responsible for 7% of gross national income, 10% of export value, 7% of total employment, 8.5 billion euro of output. And then over the last decade, the agri-food sector as a whole grew by 60% to 14.2 billion euro, producing food ingredients with a global reputation for quality and safety built on enviable grass-based systems. Global demand for food is increasing with population, urbanization, and affluence, and Irish agri-food sector is well placed to play a role. So back to this point about sales, consumers versus citizens, and this is a really important differentiation to make. I say it a lot in the UK, is we've got to stop thinking about sales as being an indicator of how well we're doing, and we've got to start thinking about our citizens and how we are relating to them and how much permission they give us to do what we do. And just to talk very quickly about social license, it's a term that I'm hearing more and more in Nuffield circles, and it's brilliant to hear it happening, but I'm not sure if everyone's aware of the origins of it. It comes from Australia, and it was coined to relate to the mining industry, and it was all about the mining industry's social license, which was going beyond compliance, going beyond legal permissions and legal minimums, and the aim was to be seen as legitimate, trustworthy by stakeholders, especially the local community. So in farming, it's about that tacit permission to utilize land and resources, and you may own and occupy the land or rent the land, be a tenant on the land, but actually people feel a more joint ownership, not just because of the air and water, but because of the reputation and the general sense that they give permission for those operations to happen. So just want to emphasize that point. So also the other kind of burning bridge I think we've got here is not just withdrawing social license, but it's extreme weather. And if you look at over the last 50 years, extreme weather events, recorded natural disaster events related to weather, we can see quite clearly that the situation is getting a lot more extreme. We've had a lot of impact from Storm Ciarán last week, and Storm Babette before then, and I think it's affected some parts of Ireland as well. Excuse me. So we have those burning bridges. So we really need to think about what we do and how we are going to increase cooperation. So move from this competitive conflict to a collaborative conflict, a cooperative conflict, so that we can actually start to solve some of these issues together. So I want to consider these, first of all, and this is again about conflict and about the dynamics at play. So I would say there's probably 6 different things. It's how we all process information, and linked to that, it's biases that we have that are at play. Social motivations, why do we get involved in these things? What is the point? Where are we coming from? The difference between engagement and education. Then we've got challenging the narrative that's out there, and we know what the narrative is out there. We only have to open the papers. And then it's about generating trust. So I'm just going to trot through these quite quickly in thinking about how we turn this into a cooperative rather than a competitive conflict. So first of all, information processing. I don't know if you have read Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, but it's all about how we think in 2 different ways. One is the quick lizard brain. It's our instincts, it's our gut reactions. It's kind of what got us where we are. It's our ability to very, very quickly process information and make immediate decisions. But that isn't always right, because that creates biases. So the other brain, the other way of thinking, is the slower monkey brain, which is about systems and processes, processing information, thinking around problems, really understanding what's going on. So thinking about those two different ways of processing information. I want to just set a quick challenge to you. I don't know if you've got a pen and a bit of paper in front of you, but I want you to look at this and say, this is the challenge. I'm going to ask you this question. I want you to give me the answer. A bat and a ball together cost €1.10, okay? The bat costs €1 more than the ball. So I'll give you 5 seconds to tell me how much does the ball cost. Okay, right. Hands up who puts 10 cents. Hands up who put 5. Oh, you see, you know. Yeah, so obviously a lot of people, and me included when I first saw that, I thought 10 cents, because that's 110 minus 1. But actually, it's got to be 5 because that's how you get the euro difference. But it's the difference between fast and slow thinking that creates difficulties with giving immediate reactions to problems like that. And biases are at play, and biases help those things to happen. And simplification is one of the biggest problems we've got, is we're facing so much information every day on a daily basis. We try and aggressively filter it to make sure that we're only taking on board the most important things. And that simplification can work against us sometimes. And we see that on social media all the time. The simplification of arguments to the point where you have no nuance, no complexity. It's just simple, polarized, black or white, really doesn't help us in these situations. And I'm going to apologize. I'm going to refer a few times to US politics because I find it really fascinating at the moment. I was listening to a podcast with Barack Obama because it's 15 years since he was elected to government. And he was talking about that whole process and what happened. And he was talking about in the run-up to the election, it was in the infancy of social media. And they only had 2 platforms. One was MySpace and one was something called Meetup. And he said the thing about Meetup was it was a way of people messaging each other to say, shall we meet up at this location for a meeting? And he said, but then you actually had to go and meet up and you talk to people. So even then, social media was used as a facilitator to go and have a proper conversation. Whereas now, through many social media channels, we're just simplifying things all the time. And we completely lose that opportunity to communicate and understand each other's point of view. And of course, what then happens is that our worldview completely dictates what we accept or what we don't. So if we see something that agrees with our worldview, it's got far more credibility and we'll take it on board. Whereas if we see things that conflict, we just reject them. And when we reject things, we find that negative information actually is something we're more happy to listen to than positive information. I know there was a newspaper launched in the UK a few years ago which claimed to give just positive news, and I think it folded within a year because nobody bought it. So this is the problem we've got, is I think it takes 5 pieces of positive information to outweigh 1 negative, and that was a study done back in the 1970s. So things that are negative are more salient. So these are the things we've got to try and overcome, but there are other biases which actually aren't so bad. So things like opposition magnification. We always think the opposition and things against us are more than they actually are. So if we actually stop thinking the problem is so big and stop being defensive and actually quantify it back to what it is. You watch social media, you look at social media, you might be excused for thinking that the world is against farming, but actually if you look at surveys and polls, you'll see there's a huge amount of trust in farmers. So don't get caught up in thinking the opposition is bigger than it actually is. There's some very vocal minorities. Also, the first thing you learn is very, very sticky, and it can play for us or against us, because if we can fill that void, if we can get in there before others, then people will remember that information, and that will become their reference point. It then becomes a challenge if others have filled that before us, because we then have to debunk it. But if we can get in there first proactively and set the scene and frame it for people, then they're more likely to think that going forward. And then there's the messenger. The messenger is very important because we listen to people we value, so we'll very quickly rate whether the person speaking is credible or not. You'll be rating whether you think I'm credible by what I say. You'll hear some things, you'll say, yeah, I agree with that, or I recognize that. And that is all part of you using your cognitive biases to rate whether I'm worth listening to and paying attention to. And there's been a really interesting work done because of, again, American politics. This issue they've got with Donald Trump, because people are so attached to him. His base is so attached to Donald Trump. So there's a group of anti-Trump Republicans who've been looking very hard at how they can actually change this dynamic. How can they extract people from their attachment to Trump and actually consider other Republican candidates? So what they've done is they've been exploring different ways of videos and advertising to try and reach his base and try and change their minds. And they showed videos of him saying things that would otherwise be really objectionable to people like them, and they still find a way to rationalize it and dismiss it. So they tried something different. What they've actually done is the only effective way of reaching them is to use other Republicans who are sharing their unscripted reservations in their own words on common concerns about Donald Trump. So people like them are really, really important in trying to reach those people. So those people like them who have voted for Trump in the past are now sharing their reservations about, his ability to beat Biden, Trump fatigue, the chaos he causes, the polarization, the way he attacks other people in his own interest. So these videos, there's one here of an Iowan farmer who's saying things like, I think he'll do a good job, but I don't think he can get elected, it's too risky. And those kind of materials are having more salience and they've been listened to more by Trump's base. So it shows you that the messenger is really, really important. Engagement versus education. This is another important thing to think about if we're going to try and shift from a competitive to a collaborative, cooperative conflict. And what we often try and do is educate. The number of times I hear people saying, we just need to educate them. If we educate them, they'll change their minds. That's all they're missing is the information. But it's not true. It doesn't work that way. Because what it's assuming is that people are the same as us and they have the same needs and they process information in the same way. And in fact, sometimes when you take people to farms and you show them the farms and you take them through everything, it might answer some questions, but then it raises other questions. And there's quite a lot of research to show that actually it can be very mixed outcome. It can sometimes actually create more of a problem. So it might raise questions about, well, why do you separate cows and calves? I didn't realize you did that because people have lost track of what happens in farming. So lack of knowledge is not necessarily the problem. It's more about engaging. And if we think about education, it goes one way. We are creating a monologue. We are telling people, we are expecting them to change asymmetrically. Whereas if we engage with them, that's a two-way dialogue. So not only are we talking to them and listening back to what they say, but then we are also allowing ourselves to change as a result as well. It's change on both sides, it's communication on both sides. And the great thing about that is it creates the opportunity for more process thinking, about more consideration, open minds, discussion, nuance, and so on, and there's opportunities for common ground. So engagement rather than education, I would urge you. I talked a little bit about social motivations. When people come into conflicts, they have different positions. So there's broadly three. One is for accuracy. I have a motivation for accuracy, and that is usually a cooperative approach. Like if they want to understand the problem more broadly, they are open to cooperation. Whereas if people come into a conflict with a defensive position, it's very, very self-driven. They don't want to change. They are defending their position. They are going to fight for it. And then we have about people thinking about their impression on others. And that can work both ways, because you can either be concerned that you come over constructively and positively, or you can be concerned that you are dominating and aggressive and controlling things and that you're seen as a formidable opponent, and that's a very competitive situation. But ways you can try and overcome that are to remove the threat. So sometimes it's things like affirming people, saying, yeah, you're a really leading expert in this, and I'm really interested to hear what you have to say, and then move on from there. So that can help to disarm people. You can do that through agreement, accountability, surprise, saying, yes, I know we haven't always done things right, I'll hold my hand up, but I'd like to talk about it. So you just need to remove that defensive position sometimes to help you move on to more cooperation. So again, I just wanted to mention the anti-Trump Republicans again, because there was another interesting part about those adverts they were doing. One thing the people who were on these videos needed to do to start with was they needed to actually say that they were Trump supporters. They had voted for Trump the first time. And this is about, sorry, I'm just looking for the right page here. Yeah, this is about disarming, because what you quite often find with people is they expect what's coming, so they put up their defenses, and then you behave as they expect you're going to, and then they just dismiss what you say. So there's another interesting thing that's happened with those Trump adverts, or anti-Trump adverts, is that those people talking disarm to start with. So they start off by establishing that they are Republicans who previously supported Trump. Otherwise, they will be dismissed as just another Trump hater. And then what happens is, because people watch these things expecting to be harangued or criticized for their support of Trump, that disarms them. They're surprised. It lets their defenses down, and that opens them up to hear more. So that is really something which we need to think about too, is how we actually get that hearing in the first place, and we can have people listen to what we say. We can get them to let their defenses down. And then there's challenging the narrative, and we know the narrative out there. We can open the paper up and see it all the time. We get it in the UK. Farmers are destroying the environment. It's really disheartening. And I think, you know, people go down to the pub. They just want to go down to the pub for a pint, and then they get harangued by somebody who says, you know, carbon emissions, water pollution, and so on. And it's not much fun being seen as a villain of society rather than a hero. So I think it's about trying to show that actually those narratives are not necessarily correct. And there's some really powerful ways of doing that. If you've got the headlines, people will consume those headlines. They'll think those headlines are true. But then actually, if you talk to them about your lived experiences, about what you're trying to do, about what your aims are, about how you care for the environment, about how you care for your animals, that can make a huge difference, because that's challenging their preconceptions. And that's, again, about debunking those stereotypes and giving them individual stories. And that's why case studies, farmer stories in the national media are really, really important, telling it from their own point of view. And I think there's a journalist who's a farmer's daughter in the Irish Times, I think. She's been actually featured in the Financial Times in the UK. And, you know, it's really great to hear her giving a very balanced account and showing that her motivations are very much in line with a lot of societies. Sometimes we can give an impression that farmers know best, and farmers do know best, because they know their animals, they know their farm, they know what's technically important. But it's not just about that, it's also about public perceptions. And I think there's more space here to have what I've seen called reflexive modernity, where you actually invite the public to talk to you about what would make them happy, about what they expect, what they value, and try and find a common way forward and sort of co-design what we're doing. Because they are important stakeholders. And back to that point about social license, is we need their support. Also, intolerance of outgroups. Outgroups, in-groups. The Trump supporters want to listen to Trump supporters. If we can actually share our motivations and the reasons why we do things, that can actually make a difference with people who aren't in our group, because it helps them to understand what our motivations are. And lastly, there's this point about dismissal, about listening, about the importance of building bridges and getting people to let their defenses down. And I'm just going to, again, read you something that I heard Barack Obama say in this podcast the other day, because I thought it was one of the most brilliant things I've heard. And he was talking about how Republicans and Democrats are at war with each other, and how they're butting heads, and how they're so polarized now. And he talked about his approach. And he said, Democrats have not always been on the right side of history. We don't have clean hands. Acknowledging that is an entry. What I'm always trying to look for is a way to get to the point where somebody who otherwise wouldn't listen, and who is fearful, and who is angry and suspicious, can stop, because they feel as if I saw them for a second. I understood their lives. And in that moment, maybe then I can persuade them that this precious thing we have, which is our ability to sort things out and exercise forbearance towards each other, and understanding, and just getting along and listening, if we can get to that moment, then I think we'll be okay. So this is exactly the point, is if we can reach out and create those opportunities and that space to actually talk to each other, it can make an enormous difference. So lastly, just wanted to mention reframing. We quite often find position A, position B, never the twain shall meet, completely divided. We are coming from different points, we want different things, we are never going to agree. But underneath that, we have needs. The needs of party A, the needs of party B, and quite often there's an overlap in those needs. So for example, in the environmental debate, it could well be that the need is to have a more reliable climate, to actually have a more resilient industry. So how can the activists and the farmers maybe work together? It won't be possible with everybody, but actually there are opportunities there. And that becomes a reframed issue where we're actually dealing with something we can both agree on, and that is leading towards a cooperative, collaborative conflict. And lastly, generating trust. I can't stress this enough, and I'm going to talk about this in the case study, is trust is something which tells people they know what to expect. It is a pattern of behavior that you repeat to the extent that people know what will come next. And it is incredibly valuable because if you can generate trust, you get a lot of latitude. So this is a study done on local government, but it's still about trust. Perceived transparency, perceived accountability, perceived responsiveness. And they were all positively correlated with trust. So lack of accountability is a barrier. It gets in the way, as does lack of transparency. And if you think about investigative journalism, it's not so much the topic they're trying to talk about, it's the fact that the party usually doesn't own it, doesn't take responsibility, isn't accountable, and they're hiding something. And as soon as that is dealt with, the issue itself is probably less important than the fact that it's being hidden and no one's taking responsibility. So if you can deal with that, that makes a massive difference to trust, especially if you do it off your own bat without being backed into a corner. And then you have to act. So it's all very well acknowledging and being transparent, but then you have to act on what you know. You have to deliver, otherwise you're just greenwashing, okay? So you need to actually put your money where your mouth is then. So these are things which all are about, oops, didn't realize it was building. So the aim of all these things is to reset this conflict from competitive to cooperative to open-mindedness, to people being motivated to seek accuracy, to think slowly and more nuanced, in a more nuanced way about what's going on, so you can actually have a proper conversation with them and you can find common ground. So thinking about what this means for us, what does this look like in farming? Well, just some examples. If we understood our stakeholders better, what do those people out there actually want? They might have a position, but what are their actual needs? Where do their needs and our needs cover over each other? How can we change those old narratives? They're so depressing. How can we reframe this problem? How can we build trust through accountability, transparency? Who can we get to talk on our behalf that's going to really make a difference and really make people sit up and they're going to trust? Who's in their in-group if we aren't already? We need to be prepared to change, and I can't emphasize that enough. We can't expect the world to change around us. We need to be part of that change as well, and we need to take that action. So thinking about stakeholders, I talked earlier about the thinking our opposition is bigger than it is. Well, this is my creation. It's not statistically accurate, but if you think about the bell curve of what everybody is like in terms of their level of concern about farming practices, I think at one end you've got the farming community. We're very, very small. We sit there in an echo chamber quite often. We talk to ourselves about how we're doing good work. We're bolstering each other's position. We're saying, great, but we're just talking to ourselves, unfortunately. Oops, sorry. There we go. And then we've got the activist community, who are also very, very small, and they're very vocal on social media. So we spend lots of time having arguments with them and hurling things backwards and forwards. And I thought about this a few years ago when we kind of had this campaign started up in the UK. I'm not sure where it came from, but we have Veganuary, which is all about vegan foods, and everybody's all, pushing vegan foods. So we thought, we could do February Dairy. So in February, we could put lots of really positive stuff about dairy farming on Twitter, and it'll be fantastic. So what then happened is there was this massive pile-on with all the vegan activists saying, we're just going to put loads of horrific imagery about badly treated animals, facts about dairy farming. And so what happened was the farming side doubled down and just did more posting, and then there was more posting from the vegan activists in response. And I just found myself thinking, what does that big orange lump there think about this discussion on Twitter? Is it helping them to understand what's happening? Is it moving our case further on? And this is the problem we've got is no point particularly in us talking to ourselves other than to, forward our technical understanding. And there's no point in us particularly engaging with that group, but there's this group here. We could do so much more with them. So how do we do it? So let's think about that and not get dragged into those negative conversations. Also, what do stakeholders want? Well, in my PhD, I looked at public perceptions of dairy farming in the UK and how we manage dairy cows. So that let me look a lot at what a lot of the science is out there, studies that have been done. And so what was interesting is I found that actually symbols of care, people don't understand about lameness, particularly details, all the different stuff that we talk about. They want symbols of care. They want straw, space, outside access. That's what they understand. Symbols, icons of care, not technical details. So we need to think about that. We also think they need a stake in farming. They feel they have a stake in farming because they, as I said, breathe the air, drink the water, live in the environment. They look at cows in fields. They feel they have a stake. They buy the products, but also the farming goes on in their community. They also want farmers to discharge their responsibilities on their behalf. So if you think about climate change, they want to make sure farmers are doing their bit for them too. It's the same with animal care. They care about animals, they care about the cows. They want to feel farmers are doing that job. They don't want to know the details. They just want to know you care and that you're doing your job. They also love their culture. And this was something I found is British people love seeing cows in fields. They don't want cows to go. So that's a good thing. I mean, it's not so good if you house cows year-round, but it's something to build on. So if you think about Irish culture, is very much one of farming. That is a fantastic thing. Is they want you to carry on. They want farming to continue. They want to be proud of it. So how can you make Irish public proud of farming? Because they will support you forever if you do that. They also want natural, but natural has got many meanings. Natural also means what's familiar and normal, and moderation, not excess. And I can't stress that enough. That was a really interesting finding for me, is excess is unnatural. Excess production, excess size, excess profits. So think about that as well when you're communicating about naturalness. They actually want farming. They love farming. Farming's very integral to what people respect. They actually trust farmers and they want farming to continue. So there are lots of positives out there. There's also a really interesting paper done last year or the year before by Anya Reagan and Ursula Kenny, and I don't know if you've seen it, but they did a great study looking at views of the public in Ireland. So stuff they're saying is that they get their information from advertising. That's the only connection they have with farmers, and they don't understand how difficult your lives are. They have a strong preference for communications without a hidden agenda. They don't like lack of transparency. If there's a vacuum, they're worried that people are filling it with misleading information. So this is all talking about proactivity, accountability, transparency. And actually, they say they're not that interested in representative bodies speaking about everything. They love to hear from people on the ground. So that is there's lots of information out there. If you understand your stakeholders, there's things to work on there. Also, I saw this EPA survey from a couple of years ago, and it actually said that, in terms of what do you think climate change will harm, well, the Irish way of life came up as quite a concern. The Irish way of life is surely integral with farming. It's surely part and parcel. So again, you have strong cultural connections there. It's important to think about these really positive things that you can build on. And in terms of advocates, this same study also showed that, yes, okay, they listen to environmental NGOs, that's in there, but they listen to scientists and they listen to the EPA. So how can we build better relationships with the EPA? Just hold that thought for a minute. Also thinking about the narrative, I don't know this lady, but there was a really interesting conversation on Twitter a few days ago about using her farmland for floodplains to try and alleviate flooding. And she was talking about, you know, there's that image on Twitter of the guy swimming through the floodwaters in Newry, which I'm sure you've seen, and they talk about the sewage in the water and why would he be doing that. Well, this was an interesting point, really interesting thread, very valid from her, but this word in yellow, what she said, the majority of farmers are willing to come to the negotiating table to discuss the realities of proposals and make a deal, but environmentalists are not. And I thought, do you know what? Being willing to come to the table is not enough. You need to be convening those meetings. You need to be driving this. And it's exactly, I think it was Pat said earlier, about proactivity. Because if you leave it, someone else will do it and they will drive the agenda. You need to be doing this, not waiting for someone to bring you to the table. And in the same, John Gilliland, we were talking about John Gilliland earlier, fantastic work done in terms of looking at carbon sequestration above and below ground. But again, the language struck me in this. This is a report in our Farmers Weekly. So farming's been shortchanged. Too much of this debate is about emotion and not enough about data. It is about emotion as well. We need data, but we need to also acknowledge the importance of the emotion in the debate. We felt that farming was being unfairly treated. If we say it's unfair, it's not right, I think that just turns people off. And I'm not saying this was John particularly, it's the way it's been reported, but I think there's great work. Are we communicating it in the most positive way? Prove to the public and governments that we can deliver, like prove. And so much of this polarized debate I've seen in the UK is around, if we use GWP star, it would all be fine. But you're using GWP 100. I mean, look at my infographic. No, look at my infographic. Where's it getting us? What we really need to think about is how we can take the charge and how we develop that trust and that accountability, that transparency, and we start to be in control of this issue. So what it says there in green, so it's time to lift our heads and get on the front foot. Absolutely. How do we do that, though? So I'm going to just give you a bit of a case study about something that happened over the last 5 years in the UK, which I think shows how we need to change what we do. Back in 2015, antibiotic resistance was basically being caused by farming. That was the narrative in the media. All these drug-resistant infections were being caused, according to the media and activist groups, by our use of antibiotics in farming. Weekly news coverage. There's a campaign group that was a collaboration between Compassionate World Farming, Soil Association, Sustain. They were just jamming these stories in, and it was relentless, and it felt just every day you'd open something and there would be a negative story about farming. And so I started working with the Responsible Use of Medicines and Agriculture Alliance in early 2016, and my brief was to tell everybody what a good job farming was doing about antibiotics. But this is the same thing again with the environment. That's not enough. How are we going to get a voice? How are we going to get people to listen to us? How are we going to push back on misinformation? Because everybody was saying, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? So the first thing we did is we knew there was a report coming out in 2016 in May from Lord Jim O'Neill, the AMR review, and we knew there was a great big chapter in there about farming and farming's role in this AMR crisis. So we were ready to launch, to say in immediate response to that, we're setting up a task force. Absolutely, 100%, we need to be involved in this. We use antibiotics as well. We are on it. We get you. Task force. We're going to work on setting our own targets. And the reason we said that is because this was the vague kind of threat being hung over us by the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, our regulator, saying we're going to set targets. And everyone was thinking, oh no, these targets are going to be really counterproductive. They're not going to be set right. They're going to have unintended consequences. So when you see something's inevitable, you just have to sometimes get with it because it's coming. And if you don't get in front of it, it's going to be dictated to you in ways you can't control. So we thought, right, we're going to get in front of this. And it took a lot of discussion to get agreement to do this because it feels really, really like you're losing control because suddenly you're going along with something, but you're not. You're gaining control because you're taking the initiative on yourself. So this was launched, this was announced, and then in September that year, the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, after a number of different discussions, actually acknowledged this task force and said the task force is going to develop targets. And we convened from 8 different sectors across the UK, livestock sectors, including aquaculture, a leading vet and a leading farm. We got them in a room, a facilitated discussion, and said, right, we've got to set some targets. How do we set about this? And they worked really hard over the next year and came up with a set of targets that were really stretching because they challenged each other. So what we did is we reframed the problem. Instead of pushing back against it and saying it's the medical community, it's human use of antibiotics that's causing the problem, because actually that was where the evidence was pointing. We just parked that debate because it's not constructive. It's those positions. That was our position. Everyone else's position was something else. So we parked that and we said it's a One Health issue. We need to engage in this. We need to play our part. And that immediately alleviated some of the pressure because we were being accountable. So that issue about why won't they take responsibility was gone in an instant. We were being accountable. We said, yeah, we're going to be accountable here for our share of the problem, absolutely. And suddenly that criticism was gone. So we challenged that narrative. We owned our share of the issue. And we started to cultivate the right relationships. And one of the really key relationships was with the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, because they were the ones who wanted to set targets. We also looked at the medical community because they were very happy to place the blame at farming because actually it took a bit of heat off them. So we started looking at how we could talk better to the medical community, talk better to the regulators, and look at where we could cultivate these relationships. We also, because of lack of transparency, decided to fill the void, create a fact base, publish information transparently. And that took a huge step as well. I mean, that's really scary stuff to suddenly just put out your facts there and say, this is how much antibiotics we're using. But they did. We did that as an industry. And you know something? Nothing bad happened because the issue was lack of accountability and lack of transparency. So that then allowed us to push back on misinformation. So we were able to create a fact base and say, look, if you're looking for information on antibiotics, come here. You can see it's transparent. Everything's laid out there. You want to know information? We're the source. Because everybody was Googling and going to the activist site, so they started to come to us. So this is now 7 years of reports we've got, every year reporting exactly what's going on in the industry. Okay, so that is as transparent as you can get. And now, 8 years on from when this first started, we have reduced antibiotic use by 60% because there's been engagement. And actually, the farming industry has found unexpected benefits of reducing, like they're going back to using different ways of controlling disease. They're stopping disease happening in the first place. We've had an FAO case study done about our voluntary approach, which is fantastic validation of how we've done this. And you know what? Dame Sally Davis was our chief medical officer. She was scathing about the farming industry. And by the end of this, she was saying, I can't tell you how proud I am of our farmers. They set their own targets. They just got on with it. And the chief executive of the VMD saying the farming industry has owned this problem. And we also set up an independent scientific group so that they could provide independent advocacy as well. And they'd come out with things like they'd look at the evidence and they'd say, okay, we advise that. You should stop feeding waste milk to calves because that's creating more antibiotic resistance genes in the industry. And that was a hard message for the industry to give the industry. But if we've got advocates from outside who are scientific experts saying it, that adds more weight. So it's all about that advocacy. And this is what happened a couple of weeks ago. This was yet another annual presentation with the Veterinary Medicines Directorate and the industry jointly presenting the sales data and the Targets Task Force report. Now, we would never have dreamt of that 8 years ago. And here you'll see the trout sector has had a big increase in use last year. But then we had Kitty Healy, who runs the AMR team at the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, defending it, saying, we know there was a big outbreak of a bacterial infection on a few farms. It was only a few farms, and we're really happy that this was dealt with very responsibly. That's our regulator. So that is about building the right relationships and having them in your corner. And I can tell you now that the pressure from activist groups, campaign groups, has tailed right off. They try, but they can't get a foothold because we're in a really strong position through accountability, transparency, relationships, all those kind of things. We've been proactive and we've got out in front of it. So I just want to finish this bit about working with society and recognizing what society needs, which we did need to do with antibiotics. I saw this tweet a couple of years ago, and a group of farmers branded up a Massey Ferguson in rainbow colours, called it Sassy Ferguson, and took it down to the Gay Pride March in Brighton. And it was great because I saw this, and it said, imagine hearing hundreds of thousands of people cheering and high-fiving for hours. Farmers have such a positive story to tell. The public adore us when we engage on society's terms rather than our own. And that is a really important lesson. We know what we need to do technically. We know what's right, but we need to engage on society's terms, and that's so important. So I'm just going to finish by thinking, well, what is the role for you guys in the room today, for past, present, future Nuffield scholars? I think you have the opportunity to see the world and to understand what's going on and to push for that change in narrative and that reframing and to be brave for an industry, because it's very hard to take this change and to feel that you're losing control when actually by doing that you're gaining control. Owning the issues, being part of society, engaging, introducing transparency, challenging the status quo, challenging the thinking, and embracing that relationship in the future. And I think you actually have a really good opportunity to do this and try and change that relationship with your key stakeholders. Right. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Last quote. If you always did what we always did, we'll always get what we always got. And that's something very important to remember. Thank you. There you go. Does anyone have any questions? Challenges? Challenge me.
Thank you very much. Louise Byrne, Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. I found your presentation really interesting, and so thank you very much for that. And I've taken a few notes to bring away with me. But I suppose one of the questions I have is in relation to information processing. And as I see it, we're a society of lizards, including the middle ground that we want to get at. And how do you, and you really were an advocate for engaging, and I would fully support that, but how do you engage on communications platforms today, you know, when we are a society of lizards?
So I actually had a bit of a conversation about this yesterday, and I don't think social media is the best way to do it, if I'm honest. I don't think it's particularly helpful because I don't think you have quality conversations on there at this stage. I mean, if you look at the antibiotics issue, we're able to put out information now and keep reaffirming the position. But I think it's about getting those conversations and probably doing it different ways. So building those advocates, having those conversations with people who influence other people. You can gain headlines, and this was something which happened with rumour, which was really interesting, was no one was listening to what we were saying. So by suddenly coming out with something really unexpected that no one would ever expect you to do, you gain headlines, and then you follow it up. So if, for example, and I'm just coming up with this off the top of my head, if, for example, the Irish farming industry said, right, you know, we need to do more. We have set ourselves a challenge that in 3 years' time we are going to do this because we hear what people are saying. We know we're part of society. We know we need to do more, and this is our challenge. And we're going to set up a website, and we're going to report, and we're going to keep putting that information down, and we're going to be transparent because we know you're proud of your farming heritage here, and we want you to be proud in the future as well. So you could even do something like that. It's about gaining that attention, and it's what Barack Obama said. It's you need to just grab that attention and then follow through with accountability, transparency, action. And I think it is about sometimes you just need to get people to sit up and take notice, say the unexpected. The people in the anti-Trump videos saying they weren't expecting to see somebody like them saying, yeah, actually, I've got doubts. So and it's also about being, being accountable, just holding your hands up. Sometimes you say, yeah, we haven't covered ourselves with glory. Yeah, so I'm going to turn this around the other way as well and say, talking to a lot of people over the last couple of days, I was really impressed with Food Harvest 2020 when it came out, and I thought, God, if only we could do this in the UK, if only we could have such a laser focus and make sure everything was directed towards an outcome like that. And now that outcome has worked against you in a way because you put all this effort into increasing milk production by 50%, and now you kind of must feel like the rug's been pulled out from under your feet a little bit because everything's changed. But then I started thinking, what if, and apologies to the minister, this is just me floating an idea, but what if government did say, hey, do you know what, with hindsight, we got that wrong. We would have done it differently, but we are where we are. Would that park some of the debate? I don't know, but sometimes people need to say things you don't expect to grab that attention and to gain a platform. And that's the only thing I can suggest is, it needs to be something quite bold. Make people sit up and listen and use that attention to then change how you engage.
Pat's my name, Amy. Thank you very much. In the last week here in Ireland, the national media carried a report that the most trustworthy profession is the doctor. Second comes the teacher. In your study, would you be able to rate the farmer or the journalist or maybe the politician in that order?
Well, I can tell you that UK politicians are about the bottom of the heap at the moment, so definitely not politicians. I haven't done that work myself, but I know that HDB did a study, our levy board did a study a couple of years ago, farmers rated very high. I think it depends what the question is. So if it's about safety in food, really good, most trusted. Farmers are really trusted. I think when it comes down to the environment, I think again HDB did a webinar a few days ago about that, and I haven't caught up with it yet, but I think it will be less so because of the narrative. And I think there's a lack of clarity more than anything else. And sometimes if people just knew, yeah, we get it, absolutely, we are working on it. We haven't got there yet, but this is what we're doing, and we're going to report back. I think sometimes that clarity, single voice of message needs to come out. But I also understand from a union point of view that, there's concern about what that's going to mean, and I totally get that. But my point is I don't think there's necessarily always an option, because it's salmon swimming upstream, it's repelling the inevitable. I think sometimes you have to say, right, this is coming, how are we best going to control it? And doing things like that can help to create a much clearer message to get across to the public. And I think once people know what your message is, and then you reinforce that by delivering and showing you're delivering and owning it and telling them when things haven't gone so well. I mean, the rumour targets get missed quite a lot. It doesn't matter, because they're trying. And it doesn't matter if you don't miss them. It's about making that consistent effort and people seeing that, and that's what builds trust.
Patrick O'Neill is my name. Amy, thank you very much for that presentation. It was very thought-provoking from my own perspective. The handful of people around here that would know me I have a background in politics. I'm currently still a local councillor, soon to step away next year. But like farming as a business and as a way of life, needs representation more than any group really, and more so at this time. And I've been attending obviously farm organisation meetings for so many years now. And this has been the talk, how can we get our message out there? And they haven't really got to solve that issue. And farm groups have become fragmented, and that then becomes you've extremes on the farm end and you've extremes on the anti-farming end, and they are clashing on social media, as you've mentioned, and then there's the middle ground and go, where do you go? I'm so middle ground and really boring at this stage, if you know what I mean. And I, like that, would like to be able to debate and put my point across, but it's very hard to do so when you know you answer one, you're going to bring on a whole barrage of others onto you, and it's just tiresome. But I suppose the question I would have, and I know you mentioned social media as being not maybe the way you see as how farmers can improve their communications, but whether we like it or not, I suppose it is where most people get their news nowadays, and media organisations, I suppose, drive social media now more so than papers. So the likes of TV, obviously Clarkson's Farm being an example, whether you like them or loathe them, the show was a good representation of the common struggles that farmers come across. That Farming Life in the BBC is another good example of farming through the year and how families cope and what they do and diversification that's going on. And in Ireland, we have obviously a number of shows that have been around for a long number of years. Like, do you see benefit in these shows and in encouraging more organisations maybe to work on something as a project like that? Do we need farming influencer becoming more on social media? Do businesses need to maybe fund some of these influencers and maybe bring new people involved and make this a job for certain people that can get our message out there and help the farming community take back the good news stories that are out there and the work that is being done, because farmers are doing so much work, particularly around the environment, and it gets thrown back at them in so many ways, shapes and forms. So, I don't like social media. I agree with you to a certain extent, but I think I don't think we have much of a choice when it comes to taking this battle onto social media. Thank you.
Yeah, so I was being a bit simplistic, strangely enough, about social media. Look, I think it's got a massive role to play, but what I'm trying to warn against is getting into those one-on-one bashing discussions. There's a number of different channels which actually offer the opportunity to moderate comments, and that is really valuable. We've got a group of social media influencers that HDB, our levy board, supports, Circle of Influence, I think they call it. And they are great because they are on TikTok, they're on YouTube, they're on different platforms, Instagram, and they do a fantastic job. And they are very good at what they do. And I think it's about, some people are good at that stuff and it lends itself to them doing it and they find their way in it, and that's great. I think what I'm trying to warn against is people feeling they have to go out there and get on social media and defend the industry, because I think that doesn't actually play well for some people. They're actually much better reaching out to local schools, we have a thing called FaceTime a Farmer, where you build up a relationship with the school and you do weekly calls. I think there's things like that definitely play a really important role. And have you come across the Hoof GP? Right, so the Hoof GP is this, what they call pimple popping culture, which is all to do with social media, where it's actually clearing abscesses in cows' feet. The hoof trimmers in the UK just hate it because apparently the practice isn't always the best. But the message that people come away with, it's got millions of followers. They come away with the fact that this guy, the industry, there's people like this who are caring about cows' feet. It's a positive one overall. They don't know the details. The same, they don't understand the technical details. They understand the big picture and what that big message is. So yes, social media is really important. Yes, if you have some people who are really comfortable in social media and really good, harness them, utilize them. Farming programs are great. Jeremy Clarkson, for all his sins, has actually, looking at Tom here, but I think you'd agree, he's actually done a really good job in terms of, people say to me all the time, he's great, I watch him, I understand so much more about farming. So all those things are good. What I would say is, what's your big message? And can everybody deliver that message? Like, we are working really hard on the environment. Like, can everybody just be focused on doing that? Because that would be really good if there was actually a purpose. You're very good at Food Harvest 2020, Food Values 2030. Like, you're very good at focusing the industry on what the strategy is, but in terms of a message, maybe the same kind of focus is needed. Harness all the different channels you have, play to your strengths, don't put people in uncomfortable positions, don't engage with the haters, basically. So yeah, but just done in a certain way.
Great. Amy Karen Brosnan, thank you very much for a really pertinent talk. So I'm just going to ask you a question now that's pretty much for the inside of this room. So as you know, because you're involved with Nuffield UK, we're on a bit of a shoestring. So in terms of readying everybody in this room to be a representative and to do those actions that you said at the very end, Nuffield Scholars, you know, reframe the issues, own the issues, engage widely. So we've Gemma Smith here, and Gemma plays a blinder at this time of year. Every year, she gets our scholars on radio, and we do have those individual voices heard, and then everything else takes over. So we don't have a PR program for our scholars that would maybe nudge them into those recommendations that you've suggested. So in terms of what the UK are doing, or in terms of what other Nuffield countries are doing, one or two next steps for us as an organisation?
Right, something that might be of interest is we've set up a reputation and public outreach group in UK Nuffield because we've got regional groups and we've got topic groups like regenerative farming and the poultry group and so on. But we actually had more and more scholars who were looking at that relationship with the public, but we didn't have any way to utilise those experiences like mine. So we've set up this group, and then we talked about, well, what do we do as a first project? So Navaratnam Partheeb, who is a vet who is a Tamil, actually, originally ethnically Tamil, who is very much, his project was all about diversity and inclusion. So our first project is we are actually setting up a diversity and inclusion training module, which the Nuffield trustees have very kindly backed. And we are going to roll it out and encourage as much of the farming and associated industries as possible to do it. And then if they're willing to go onto a register. So if people want to come into the industry and to have practical experience and try working with vets, try working with farms, that they can go to somewhere where somebody's had that training and they can feel more confident. Because we have a massive labour shortfall in the UK. A third of the children, school-age children, are non-white. We cannot get those people to be interested in farming because we are a white industry and we don't appear welcoming to them. We're hoping this will help. And in that whole process of doing that, I think is a positive reputational thing to say it challenges people's perceptions about farming and it says something different. So there are things like that. You could maybe set up a group and look at what you could do to challenge perceptions and have some leadership messages, get out there and actually some projects to do, utilising, get a sponsorship. So we've got very lucky to get some sponsorship for this project. There's a lot of farming suppliers or people who are involved in the farming industry who you already have as sponsors. So that kind of thing could work well. But I think I would suggest the challenge would be, how do we say, we've got this, we hear you about the environment and we're on it. And the 4 scholars speaking this year, I mean, there's some amazing stuff. So what's coming out of that, as well as what you're taking back for your own farm, what can you do for the reputation of the industry? Because you've got an amazing industry, reading the food values statement about the export potential, your reputation, it's amazing. And you're doing so much. I mean, the Minister talked about AgNav. I've been looking at all these different things that you're doing and wishing we had a similar sort of focus and cohesion in the UK. I know there are things going on, but it's just, there's so much happening, Origin Green, things to be envied. So do people really know about that? You saw the paper by Anya Regan and Ursula Kenny. I don't think people do know about it. So how can you use what you've got, what you know, to try and get out there in some sort of group, make a big, bold statement, work within your resources, get sponsorship, something like that, I would say.
Thank you very much, Amy, for your engaging presentation. It was fantastic and very thought-provoking. And David Fennelly is my name, 2023 scholar. Patrick raised my question there in terms of farm organisations, and you kind of went on to focus a bit about our engagement with the middle ground, or the biggest part of the distribution curve. But we have one main farming organisation that represents 70,000 farmers and about 6 or 7 other groups, from the Hill Farmers Association to the grain growers in the other side of the country. Currently in the IFA we have an election race for the presidency and the deputy president, and specifically if you were tasked with the unenviable job as president of the largest farming organisation in the country, what immediate actions or short-term actions would you take to bring a more coherent and more cooperative approach to lobbying with the government specifically, or the EU?
So, political questions are difficult because I'm from the outside looking in, but I completely understand the desire to push back against change. I absolutely 100% get it, and we have it in the UK. And a lot of the concern is around, you know, how's money going to make its way back? How are we going to get paid for what we do? I think you have to look at the longer term picture and say, can we win this in that competitive conflict? Can we actually win this? I'm not sure you can by repelling it and saying we can't change. I don't think that's going to work because, as again, I think it was Pat or David said before, that this change is happening. This is like going, and we can't stop it. This is the planet. This is the world. And as an export market, you need to be in touch with what the world's saying. You need to provide a product which is going to tick boxes, because this is one of the best places in the world to produce meat and dairy. So you need to think about how you can make it easy for your purchasers globally to choose you because of your environmental credentials. So as comforting as it is to push back against things, and I absolutely get it, and we have it in the UK as well, I think you have to think that that is not sustainable long term, and potentially think about how can we actually engage proactively in a way that gives us more control over it. So, for example, targets. I was talking, was it you I was talking to about nitrates earlier? So nitrates. So interestingly, there's a blunt instrument at the moment, like this is the cap, we're going to get rid of the derogation, blah, blah, blah. That's fine. What do we know about what's actually coming out in watercourses? Are you taking control of that? Can you do it an outcome-based model? Can you actually say, right, we get you, we hear you, we understand, we are going to look at this and come up with the most effective way of dealing with it and come back and propose. So could you do something where you're actually set up a watercourse monitoring? They're doing that with the River Wye at the moment in the UK, where we've had a huge amount of chicken production in the area, and the pollution is being blamed on the chickens, and the chicken industry is engaging with that, but you have to kind of they've started monitoring the river because then they've got the data, they can push back and say, right, we want to deal with this in the best available technique, the most scientific way, but you can only do that if you engage and you say, right, we hear you, we get it, but let's look at what we actually want to achieve. Instead of having two opposing positions, find our common need, and we're going to drive that forward. So I suggest sort of two sides of a question there, but one, I think you have to engage because you can't hold this back. Second, take control of it. Do it on your terms. Find metrics that work for you. And in the rumour situation, that's worked really well because actually everybody's saying that's been a really good move, having control in the industry of what our targets are, because then we can make sure they're meaningful, we can make sure that we're doing them right, we can make sure that actually animal welfare is a key part of the discussion. So again, it's about control. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's about you can't stop these things, you need to get in front of them. We have the same discussion around method of production labelling in the UK, where the animal rights organisations are pushing for it. And we managed to get it paused, but I don't think we can win this. I think we have to actually take a proactive step to design our own method of production labelling, because it's going to come and we're not going to be in control. So get in front of those issues and manage them from in front. Control the narrative. Be seen as the heroes, not the villains, because you will be if you take control and you do something. Thank you very much. I think that's me being told time up.